Something in the way.
Is that my eyeshadow?
The Batman is a gorgeous, grim, somewhat depressing tale of an angsty young man who is barely keeping it together, yet has taken it upon himself to rid his bleak, crime-ridden city from as much corruption as he can leap out from the shadows at. From himself at. For he is the shadows. Matt Reeves' Batman is perhaps the most grounded in his time frame live-action Batman we've ever seen. Whereas Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight clearly dons the cape for the first time, becomes comfortable, ages, retires, and then comes back, while watching Batman himself on screen, it seldom feels too different. He's always clever, he's always strong, he's always efficient. I'm far from saying that version of Batman feels trite or boring, just that in any given fight or in any given altercation, Batman remains Batman. It's usually not that different depending on what part of the trilogy we're at. In fact, in the first scene we ever get out of him in the cape in Batman Begins, he beats the hell out of Falcone's men, apprehends him, and hands him over to the police efficiently and without a scratch, like a veteran Batman of a decade or more. In Zack Snyder's renditions, he's clearly an older, gruffer, more grizzled version of the Cape Crusader, but we never really get to see him grow or evolve, and we're only made vaguely aware of what has happened to make him like this. For Robert Pattinson, however, and perhaps it's mostly because this is the first time we've ever seen such a clearly young version of Batman, it seems more concise. His immaturity, his recklessness, it's on full display. It's not just present, it's at times the main aspect of a moment or scene. Now, I think both Christopher Nolan and Zack Snyder do a more than serviceable job of defining and utilizing Batman along his crime-fighting timeline. I just think this movie does it a little better and takes advantage of it a whole lot more. It's a stylistic choice, not a necessary one. The former two franchises chose other aspects to focus more time on, as was their right. And they, certainly more in Nolan's case in my opinion, absolutely nailed the themes and elements they chose to hone in on more closely. And, much like Batman, Gotham itself has wonderful characterization for its timeline as well. Right from the very first time we see him on screen, we're shown a world who doesn't really respect or understand the Dark Knight all that much. From his narration, it's clear that only recently has the Bat symbol begun to strike fear into the hearts of criminals, and far from them all, which is evidenced by every member of the face-painted clan aside from a single member wholly ignoring the symbol and scoffing at the Batman as if he were little more than a kid playing dress-up. It's not until later, when he kicks the ever-living shit out of them all, they start to take him a little more seriously. When Batman first locks eyes with a young man who noted his bat symbol and was taken aback by it, I was expecting a particular moment. I expected the exact same thing a few scenes later, too, when he was investigating the mayor's crime scene and locked eyes with the little kid. But that's because I went into this movie with the wrong expectation of what this Batman was going to be. What I wanted, or rather what I was hoping for and expecting, was a line such as, "Get out of here, kid, while you still can." Not in terms of before I pile drive you to the ground and paint the train tracks with your intestines, but with here meaning the world of crime he was becoming integrated into. Get out of this game before it's too late. With the kid, I was waiting for something like this. But again, wrong Batman. This Batman could never do that. Are you kidding me? He's far too awkward to string along anything resembling that level of personal connection, and far too disinterested in people that take a special interest in helping them on that level. Even a young kid, or perhaps especially a young kid, because that would take more tact and consideration. This Batman wants to prevent crime, save lives, and stop corruption, but he likes to achieve most of that through his fists and his cunning, two things that don't require much collaboration. Though we get little on his relationship with Gordon, I surmised him as being one of the very few people Batman seems a bit comfortable interacting with. Plus, his relationship with Gordon is extremely beneficial for him, allowing him inside information that would be hard to come by on his own, as well as access to crime scenes Gordon's fellow cops clearly despise his presence at. I could see this Batman entering into this partnership as a means to get into what otherwise would have been a locked door: police knowledge. When he's at the mayor's crime scene, he's slow, methodical, and downright dramatic. At times it takes him 49 seconds to bend down and pick an item up, but goddammit other cops, don't rush the Batman while he's hard at work, because he picks up on many things the other cops don't, and you can see immediately why Gordon likes having him around so much, even if we haven't learned just yet how much Gordon has come to truly respect the vigilante. If it was one-sided for Gordon initially like it may have been with Batman, it isn't anymore. They both respect each other and enjoy working things out together. They think that's what's best for the city. A comparison I see a lot to this movie is Seven, the David Fincher psychological thriller, and for good reason. This movie absolutely takes no shame in utilizing a large amount of that movie's motifs and story beats, pairing darkly lit, slow-moving scenes with riddles and clues spiced in to get us from one point of the story to the next. Another one is for Bruce Wayne specifically, and that he resembles Travis Bickle, Robert De Niro's character from Taxi Driver. This one is also quite on the money. Both characters talk, move, and exist as if every single second of their life is so soul-crushing and agonizing that there is simply no one alive who could possibly understand it. With this Bruce Wayne, it's actually rather deserved. He hasn't even come close yet to reconciling with his past, and he hasn't figured out what sort of public figure he wants to be for Gotham yet, at all. At the risk of another pop culture reference so shortly after the 38 Others, a comparison I quickly made while watching this film was to that of Sherlock and Moriarty, specifically from the BBC version that I'm most familiar with and fond of. The Riddler is always one step ahead, feeding Batman handmade clues so he has even the slightest of chances of catching up, all while keeping him at such arm's reach that by the time he's finally in bars, more or less of his own accord, Batman still fails to notice the Riddler's biggest and most destructive scheme yet. Whereas Moriarty was perpetually bored with life, superior to his peers in such a way that no triumph could ever bring him even a modicum of joy, the Riddler seems more like he's simply taking his riddling game to the next level by challenging someone whom he deems a worthy adversary. Sherlock has chosen to bring joy to Moriarty, as the prospect of an intellectual equal is way more thrilling for him than his world of high-level organized crime could ever elicit. The Riddler's motives for choosing the Batman are a little more up for interpretation. We don't exactly know what Batman has been up to in the last 2 years aside from generally fighting crime and all that. We don't get much in terms of specifics. After ruminating on the film farther and watching it a few more times, it became clear why this connection wasn't as readily made nor as accurate as some of the others. But the game of cat and mouse played by this pair, with each possessing such a high level of both clear intellect and clear insanity, I couldn't help but note the similarities. Batman and Sherlock are usually the two main characters who come up in the conversation of fiction's best detective after all, and their similarities don't usually begin and end there. But enough ranting. Let's break this analysis down into a more organized format, starting with the acting and the characters themselves. Now, when Robert Pattinson was cast as Batman, it was met with an unsurprising amount of backlash. A similar amount of backlash to Heath Ledger's The Joker, I might add. The people who had followed his careers post-Twilight and watched some of his work since then were not a part of this group, or at least very few were. Robert Pattinson is absolutely excellent in things like The Lighthouse, Good Time, Tenet, The Devil All the Time, among others. His emotional range and transformation into various roles, despite his clear disdain for anything resembling method acting, is remarkable, and I for one would have had him extremely high on my list to play the Batman even before I knew when this movie would take place. Once I heard it was going to be a year 2 rendition, there was no one even close. He is absurdly good in this role. He's excellent at playing Batman, and thank God for that, because this movie has absolutely no interest in Bruce Wayne. This movie has about as much interest in Bruce Wayne as Bruce Wayne does, and I love how this movie and Robert Pattinson both bring that concept into light. From the way he handles the reversion and disdain from cops and others alike while working as the Batman, versus how we see him handle others briefly during the funeral without the mask, it's very clear which one he prefers. He plods along as the Batman, slowly, confidently. He is never in any rush, and he's clearly in his element. The perversion he is met with is borderline welcome. Now compare that to how he is as Bruce Wayne. People are enamored with him, and floored to see him in public. Immediately we can see that he detests that, and I've got a good theory as to why. See, whether as Bruce Wayne or as Batman, his main, and perhaps exclusive goal is to help the city of Gotham. As a Wayne, he has power, he has wealth, and he has influence, but he doesn't seem very interested in utilizing any of those. Not yet anyways. He still seems very opposed to all this, perhaps because they're nothing but a reminder to the loss of his parents and the events that led to such a shattered psyche. As Bruce Wayne, he deserves no applause. He hasn't earned it yet, and he hates that he receives it, so he hides behind the mask at every turn. As Batman, however, he has earned it, and I know later down the line it could become draining on him, his alter ego receiving backlash and hatred from the citizens despite him risking so much to help them, while his billionaire real-life persona gets praised for doing absolutely nothing. But for now, I think he just prefers being a little less cheered, a little less celebrated. He greets the perversion of the cops and criminals with little hatred. As I said before, he seems to kinda like it. It's a wonderfully interesting dichotomy, and this movie presenting us with so much Batman and so little Bruce Wayne only highlights the character's preference of his personas. There is very little I'd change about this Batman, and any gripes I might have with the character come more from a writing perspective or an interesting choice made elsewhere, and not with him specifically. Christian Bale was fantastic, and those movies still absolutely have their leg up and improvements comparatively, but Robert Pattinson is my Batman. He has absolutely become the character already. Jeffrey Wright, as Commissioner Gordon, is excellent. He gives the character a wonderful vibe, and his banter with Batman is always pleasurable. This might be my favorite ally of Batman's to see alongside him on screen. Zoe Kravitz is also quite good as Catwoman, though I think both her character and their romance doesn't quite get the development it needs. It's not bad by any means, just maybe not as well done as the rest of the film. She's always nice to see on screen, and I'm sure we'll get more of her in the future, which is something I'm all for. Now, antagonists. This movie has a few of them. Carmine Falcone, Oswald Cobblepot, and the Riddler are all obviously included and play large roles. Now throw in a brief and enticing Joker scene, and then the many other references to Gotham villainy, which are as follows. Batman's potential use of the Venom injection, something closely associated with the villain Bane. Hush is written over one of the photos in a way that at the least is a fun Easter egg, but could potentially be a teaser for the villain Hush, Bruce Wayne's old childhood friend who has teamed up with the Riddler in the past. Harvey Dent has the slightest of potential references, as the position of district attorney remains vacant following the final acts of the movie after Gil Coulson dies gruesomely during the mayor's funeral. In that scene as well, Coulson tells Batman, "You have no idea how deep this is." This could be a reference to the Court of Owls or even the League of Shadows maybe, but probably more the former if anything. Add in the twins we see minding the nightclub potentially being a slew of Batman antagonists like the Trigger Twins, the Tweedle Twins, Orman and Max, who I like most for this if they decide to take those characters farther. They act as Harvey's first real cronies when he starts transitioning into Two-Face, and since I also like the chance of Harvey Dent arriving sooner rather than later, even as soon as the new Penguin spin-off show, fighting crime as a DA while the power grab for Gotham's underground plays out in all its glory, it seems to fit rather nicely. I found it quite odd that they greenlit a Penguin-featured spin-off before the Batman had even released, but now that makes pretty good sense as Gotham is ripe for some very dangerous and pretty exciting shit to go down. Plus, among the 3 main villains, excluding the Joker as he's little more than a cameo, Colin Farrell as Oswald Cobblepot, otherwise known as the Penguin, is probably my favorite and the most entertaining. This line alone...
Got something to tell us?
Yeah! It's like the white Spanish I have heard.
What?
No habla español, fellas?
Do me a favor.
solidifies that for me. He is great, he is unrecognizable in the role, and I desperately want more of him. Thankfully, more of him is already confirmed. John Turturro as Falcone is fine. He's good, he's interesting, he's menacing, and I don't mind in the slightest that he's dead and we won't see him again. What his death will mean to Gotham is far more interesting than what he as a character could have ever done. At least that's how I saw it. Obviously I could be wrong, he's not bad or boring by any means, and I'm sure there's a shit ton more below the surface that we never really got to see. Not every single character in this movie can have endless development and a rich backstory. And now we get to Paul Dano as the Riddler. First of all, what great casting. Dano has held his own as some of the very, very best, and after seeing When There Will Be Blood and Prisoners, you're going to have a really hard time arguing that he isn't perfect for this kind of role. I'm incredibly glad to see him get a very high-profile role in such a massive film, and I'm very happy that we'll more than likely get more of him in the future, too. Sadly, my problems with him are a bit more numerous than my problems with the other characters I've mentioned so far. Starting with how they get Paul Dano to portray the Riddler himself. He's always good, his movements and words are creepy, they're menacing, they're uneasy, all that good stuff. But he doesn't really get all that much time to shine. Hidden behind a thick mask viewed largely through a camera while changing the pitch of his voice, this character could have easily been played by not Paul Dano for large chunks of it, and it wouldn't really change all that much. And that makes me a bit sad. When we do get to see Dano really take over, it's excellent. One of the best scenes in the entire movie is his conversation from prison with the Batman. In it, he's ambiguous, unsettling, mentally unstable, and yeah, at times he feels like he's borrowing a bit too heavily from the Joker, but I'm not all that upset about it. It's never too heavy-handed, and in a nice mirror to Batman himself, I fancy this villain someone who's still very much figuring out what type of criminal he wants to be. The plot regarding the Riddler itself is serviceable as kind of the main plot thread in the movie, but not much more than that. It's good, but it's not the best part of the film by a long shot. Thumb Drive was a significantly goofy moment which had me going, alright, I could see this guy appearing on screen in a green suit laden with question marks next, but we don't really get that much else in the way of humor from him. Again, that's fine, not a big deal at all. I don't mind the lack of outright humor in this movie in the slightest. Plus, between every scene the Penguin is involved in, the Commissioner Gordon Batman hushed conversation in the interrogation room, followed by him running like Adam West away from a comically large group of chasing officers, and this guy...
You could be an accessory to murder.
The movie does not lack in levity. Seriously, this scene is the funniest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. I did not know a human voice could even remotely sound like that, and I am oh so glad that it can. Where's this guy's spin-off? So Batman, perfect. Penguin, perfect. Commissioner Gordon, excellent. Catwoman and the Riddler, very good. Falcone is a little lower than the rest of them, but still well above the character I got the least out of, Alfred Pennyworth. Now, like every actor in this film, Andy Serkis is not remotely doing a bad job. When he's on screen, he's fine. Him and Bats are clearly close, but not in any meaningful way. If his name wasn't Alfred and we didn't already know who he was, his almost death scene would not have held much weight. And I'm sure it didn't to those who watched this movie without much Batman knowledge. He has a few good lines, but he plays almost no role in this movie whatsoever. And with a young and vulnerable Batman living under the same roof as him, I would have expected a little more in the way of fatherly wisdom. Having said that, Bruce does give a line that suggests he may already have tried and failed at that, and maybe this was the intermediary stage where he was letting Bruce figure things out on his own, hoping to God that he didn't die before he could grow up a little bit. So maybe he does deserve a little bit more slack in that regard. But regardless, they could have maybe peppered in a bit more in the way of showing us how much Alfred cares for Bruce, instead of just relying on us already knowing that going in. I didn't hate this Alfred, but he wasn't my favorite part of the movie. I mentioned how showing us Bruce and Alfred's relationship would have been nice despite us already knowing their closeness going into the film, but there was something else this movie lacks entirely that I am incredibly happy with, because no one at this point doesn't know Batman's origin. It's mentioned, yes, but it's never shown to us. No flashbacks, no heavy-handed explanations. Mwah, that's perfect. The MCU took a similar approach with the Tom Holland Spider-Man, and it is much better because of that. If the first 30 minutes of this film took place before he donned the cape, or even cutting back and forth between present day and before, it would have been a slog to get through. Instead, we see Batman instantly, and it's such a different version of the Batman that we're used to that we're immediately hooked. It's incredibly refreshing. Now, I will admit this movie does drag a little bit. Its pacing isn't bad to me at all. It's just more of a slow burn. Less action, more talking, sulking, more contemplating. But with Batman being such an endlessly enjoyable and analyzable character, and with the fact that he was on screen for nearly the entire film, I didn't mind the slow pacing at all. It actually gave me the chance to really analyze and decipher every single little thing he was doing or saying, which, frankly, is a lot of pressure to put on this movie. and it's a testament to how well it works that putting your main character under such scrutiny doesn't reveal cracks, but rather amplifies just how well Matt Reeves and Robert Pattinson understand this character. Never did I get a line or a look or a decision that made me go, wait, what? Why would he do that? That seems off. And I did get that here or there during the Christopher Nolan trilogy, and more often than that in the DCEU. Where the pacing does somewhat affect the enjoyment of the story, however, is in its final 30-odd minutes. Much like Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, this movie has about 9 separate scenes that easily and probably should have been the ending, but it kind of just keeps going on and on. Each scene was important and provided us with valuable knowledge and insight that I'm glad wasn't left out entirely. But maybe just streamline it a bit? Quicken the pace of these post-Riddler and prison scenes and cut that down by a few minutes, and I don't know, it's hard to say what should and shouldn't be there, but it's also hard to shake the feeling that it didn't drag on just a touch too long towards the end. There wasn't a scene I thought could outright be cut, but still. Maybe a bit more time and thought away from the film, and another rewatch or two later down the line could help clarify my regards on this matter. But for now, it does still feel like it had a last scene and ended really well, and then had another scene, and that one ended really well, and then there was another scene, and that one ended pretty well, and then there was another scene, and that one ended well, and then there was another. From this movie alone, we could easily see endless sorts of villains, both threatening on their own and working as a tandem or in a group like the Joker and the Riddler seem poised to. On the other side, give me the Bat family. Please, it's been way too long. Giving this Batman the chance to grow and learn to be the type of vigilante Gotham needs while mentoring Robin and seeing the error in his ways would be so poetic. We start with a Batman who thinks he can intimidate the criminal underground of Gotham into behaving, and he learns throughout the course of the movie that that's just not going to cut it. Some people have perceived this as a slap in the face of who Batman is fundamentally, and that makes sense. For the final message of a Batman movie to be Gotham doesn't need Batman would be dreary and unsatisfying as heck. But that's not what I took from this. I mean, look at the parallel from his first narration of the movie, where he refers to himself as the Shadows, to this scene here, where he is now the light within the shadows. He falls into the water and emerges cleansed of his foolish notions of what kind of hero he needs to be. No one could convince me that that's not cinema. Not even you little... Get out of here, you. You're great. I'll get to you later. This Batman starts to learn that being vengeance and beating the shit out of people isn't enough. This city needs a hero, a beacon of light, a symbol, something to inspire hope and make people want to do better, because there's someone out there in a mask and a cape willing to do whatever it takes to make the city better. Keeping the criminals in check and stopping them when he has to is another facet, not the entire thing. Gotham needs Batman, it always has. And Batman needs Gotham too. For God's sakes, without something else to fix and distract him from his own problems, this Batman probably would have given up on life and imploded a long time ago. A little bit like the Bruce we see in The Dark Knight Rises, but probably to a much more drastic and dramatic extent. Speaking of that trilogy, I do think most of us should settle down in terms of comparing it to The Dark Knight. That movie is the benchmark for Batman perfection, and while I think this movie is in contention for a similar title, they just tell such different stories. Like, take this one, a movie that plods along rather slowly. It takes its time, introducing us to new themes and concepts and teaching us about the world and its dynamics. In contrast, The Dark Knight is incredibly snappy and wastes zero time while telling us its story. Nothing lingers, nothing is slow, there's no fluff, for better or for worse. Part of that is due to Nolan as a filmmaker, and part of that is due to it being the second movie in a franchise, not the first. It doesn't need as much time to hash out all its themes and concepts because it already has, or at least a portion of them. A much fairer comparison to me would be to Batman Begins, though they're also somewhat different films, given the lack of an origin story in the Batman and a much more focused narrative on crime and detective work. Batman Begins spends ample time teaching us who Bruce Wayne is and what's turned him into the man he is and strives to be. I don't need to tell you how little this movie focuses on who Bruce Wayne is. They're similar enough to compare in my books, and after rewatching Batman Begins after watching The Batman for the first time, and letting them both sit for a while until my recency bias wore off as much as possible, I do think The Batman did a bit better of a job of telling its story, though time could absolutely warp that opinion of mine. Regardless, it's a great goddamn time to be a Batman fan, and a great time to be a fan of superheroes in general, my goodness. If you guys have any interest in me reviewing or discussing anything upcoming, or anything that's already been released, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe, comment all the reasons you think I'm an idiot, and tell me how bad my opinion is. I mean, be friendly and nice too if the fancy strikes you, but this is the internet after all. Negativity seems a touch easier to come across, and I think I can handle it. Just kidding, I'm back again. A few closing thoughts I didn't want to leave out of this. Going back a little bit to my comment on Bruce Wayne deserving no praise while receiving it, while Batman gets the exact opposite. I think that's a large reason why some of Batman's villains have become so iconic, and I really hope that's a concept they play around with in future installments. Sure, our current Bruce Wayne doesn't really mind, but I think eventually the persona of his he identifies most with being vilified by the very people he is trying to protect can wear someone down, and people like the Joker know this and use it to tell the Batman how he's too good for Gotham, and how the city and its people don't deserve him. It never makes him go, yeah, screw Gotham, good point, man, but it can waver his morals and thought processes a bit at times, keeping him off balance and less sure of himself, which is kind of all villains and antagonists like the Joker want. Speaking of the Joker, I wrote and mostly finished this script only 3 days after the Batman originally came out in theaters here, before running into a slew of recording and editing issues my inexperienced ass needed an ungodly amount of time to figure out. Because of my ineptitude and my inability to get this video out when I intended to, I wrote this entire thing when all we had was a Joker who was relegated to a one-scene cameo with little depth, and that was it. Now, however, since the release of that deleted interrogation scene, I do want to give my thoughts on it before I actually go. I'll start by saying 2 things. I really like this Joker so far, and I'm very glad they cut this scene from the movie. For a couple of reasons, so let's start there. The main reason is that it would have been a bit awkward and unnecessary in this film. The entire scene kind of exists just to introduce us to Joker, which is great and fine, but it also exists a bit to shove the movie's themes right down our throat. At the risk of being a bit dramatic, it would kind of be patronizing for the film to give us a scene that just goes, hey, here's what we've been talking about and showing you for the last 2 hours in case you weren't clever enough to catch it. I doubt that was the intention when they wrote and filmed it, but that's kind of how it comes off. And the fact that Matt Reeves and company noticed that and cut it is lovely. Plus, this scene would have massively undercut the movie's other interrogation scene, which was much more important and impactful. Having an unnecessary Joker scene upstage the main villain's biggest scene would have made a lot of people very upset, and for good reason. So huge kudos to them for shooting it and then ultimately cutting it. Releasing it later also allows for the best of both worlds, wherein we as an audience can accept this scene as canon and that it actually occurred during the timeline of the film, but it doesn't have to exist as a permanent scene slightly watering down the original product. It now acts as just supplemental information. I'm sure the studio wasn't keen on cutting a scene featuring such a popular moneymaker like the Joker, so again, the decision and ability to cut this only speaks to how much they're going to let Matt Reeves really just do his thing here and trust in him. With few exceptions, giving the director free reign and staying out of his business is always preferable. And like I said, I like this Joker. I like his vibe, I love his voice, I absolutely adore his design. Barry Keoghan is yet another enticing and deeply interesting actor to portray this role, and I can't wait to see what direction they decide to go with him. I can only hope they take their time with him and use him efficiently and not try to make him too big and important too soon. I'd like the limelight to be on some others from his rogue gallery for a time, but I'll always be content knowing he's out there somewhere up to no good. What a movie! When's a sequel? I wonder if Bruce Wayne's so jaded because he spent too much time with a woman to phone that godforsaken lighthouse. Bye everyone, see you next time.